Africa-China relationship is now going back to the fundamentals. I've said this a couple of times in the sense that the relationship started as political even before it became economic, right? And now, given the geopolitical context, there is a real interest in seeing how Africa and Africa-China relationship can be on benefit to China in this context. So I'm talking about so-called great power competition, right? But for the African perspective, they are not really interested in great power politics. At least that is what everybody says.
On the security issue, I am also very intrigued to see what the wording will be, but I don't particularly expect much firmer commitment from China, particularly in kind of hotspot areas like in Sudan, for example. I tend to think that it's domestically unpopular in China and that they don't want to get involved. So I expect some form of at least lip service to be paid to security, but I also expect that it will probably happen under the auspices of the UN or as via kind of funding to the AU or something like that, something indirect.
Africa must take greater ownership of its strategic thinking. While China has released multiple official statements and papers on its strategy in Africa, there's a glaring absence of corresponding papers detailing strategic approaches to China from African countries, regional bodies, or the continent as a whole. This asymmetry leaves Africa perpetually in a reactive stance, scrambling for benefits rather than driving the agenda.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, still in Johannesburg, but on his way to Cape Town. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus is in the midst of a big move, so we're grateful that you had some time in amidst the boxes and the keys being handed over to join us today. Hey, Cobus, we are now less than a month away from the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit that's going to take place in the first week of September in Beijing. This is the 9th FOCAC. For those of you who've been following this podcast, we've been covering FOCACs now for 15 years. And so it's fun that this is back around because what it does is it allows you to do a pulse check on the China-Africa relationship. And that's what we're going to do today. Just to bring you up to speed, we know what's going to happen. This is something unusual. In years past, we did not know the dates or what was going to happen until literally a few days before the event, but the Chinese government has been a little bit more forthright in letting people know about the schedule. So from September 2nd and 3rd, there's going to be a senior officials meeting. That's what they call it. Most likely that's going to be at the ministerial level. And then from September 4th to the 6th, there is going to be a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping and an unknown number of African heads of state. We are expecting a rather high number. You know, Cobus, it's been a year or a year and a half of lots of Africa Plus One summits. There's a little bit of fatigue among African leaders after going to Turkey, to Russia, to South Korea, to Europe, to the United States for the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit back in 2022. But FOCAC is different, and FOCAC has really, again, a special place in the minds of a lot of African leaders. One of the things that we're seeing right now is African governments are finalizing their strategies. Last week, the government of Gabon held a public event to kind of announce their FOCAC strategy is done. It's a big deal for a lot of these governments, and it looks like they're going to Beijing with a lot of plans in their pocket. The question is, Cobus, we don't know what tone it's going to take given the fact that the Chinese economy in 2024 is very different than the Chinese economy in 2015 and 2012 and previous FOCACs.
Yes, I mean, this is going to be the big question of how much kind of financial commitment China is able to put into FOCAC and how that will then be framed and packaged. Because, you know, I think we expect some vagueness about the commitments, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of pressure from the African side for China to step up. And it's going to be interesting to see what China can actually deliver.
Well, what we're going to do again all month is we're polling African scholars, African analysts, and observers to tell us what do they expect out of FOCAC? What are they looking for? And there's really no better person to have us kick off this month of shows about FOCAC than with our old friend Ovigwe Eguegu, who is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. And my God, Ovigwe, you are going to get the prize in this podcast for sacrifice. He is joining us on the line from Toronto. Normally he's in Abuja at a reasonable hour, but it is 4 a.m. And so Ovigwe, a very good morning to you, and thank you for sacrificing your sleep to join us on the show today.
Hello, good morning, Cobus. Good morning, Eric. I think it's a pleasure being back because this platform, China Global South, is very dear to me. So even if it was meant to be at 1 a.m. my time, I will still be here. So it's a pleasure being with you guys this morning.
You are a dear friend of Ovigwe, and so we appreciate it. And we are grateful you're here, both because of the sacrifice to your sleep that you've made, but also because your insights. So the question we're asking everybody is, what are you looking for at FOCAC 9? You sit in Nigeria most of the time. What do you think countries in West Africa are looking for? What should we expect? Give us the headline of what people should take away from FOCAC 9.
It's good that you actually brought up West Africa, for instance, and even Nigeria. If we start from that vantage point, I would say it would be a continuation of using FOCAC as a platform to strengthen the relationship between China and the African side. You may remember that the foreign minister of Nigeria has been to China in the last 1 year, for instance, less than a year that the administration has been in office. He has been there twice, right? He was there for the Belt and Road Forum. He was also there on an official visit at the invitation of the Chinese foreign minister in June, I think, yes. So Nigeria in particular has been working very, very tirelessly to deepen that the relationship. But overall, or at least from that same vantage point, the West African region, we also saw, for instance, when Foreign Minister Wang Yi was making his first trip then to the continent, which is of course traditionally his first foreign trip, he chose West Africa had the most visits in the region. And I think this actually showed a pattern that even we in Development Reimagined were studying to see that many countries in West Africa as a sub-region has the least, you could say, closest bilateral ties with China from the perspective of the ranking of their partnership. So you would have, for instance, Nigeria has not even upgraded its relationship with China for over 10 years. We're still at a strategic partnership level, and so there's a lot of work in that direction. But if you compare West Africa to other regions, you have more of those very, the much you could expect it to be high ranked relationship. Like, for example, Ethiopia has an all-weather kind of partnership, strategic partnership, and there's a popular comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership. So one of the things I'm looking out for as of Africa as a whole, or even for West Africa, is how in recent years we've been seeing this upgrade in the relationship and trying to track what that means for the substantive, benefits that comes with those with these upgrades. Because the theme for this year, is about strengthening ties for building a community for a shared future, right?
But what does that mean, though, in practice? What does that mean in reality? I mean, I understand that the diplomatic relationship is strong, but is it money that people want? Do they want loans? Do they want infrastructure financing? How does that translate into reality?
Yeah, I was just coming to that. So when we say want Africa and China to join hands to advance modernization and build this high-level China-Africa community, from the African side, a lot of that has to do with development. That is still the issue. In recent years, we saw the language shift to represent this small and beautiful kind of project, to indicate a shift away from those large, big-ticket infrastructure projects. However, the big infrastructure projects, despite the concerns about debt and all of that, is still needed in the continent. The last time I was on this program, I was making that comparison between Africa and India, for instance, saying that the Indian budget for 2023 had 120 billion set aside for infrastructure projects. For African countries, if you total all of the commitment they have made to infrastructure, it's not even near half of that. Meanwhile, we have about the same population, right? The African Development Bank has said about 100 billion or 210 billion is what Africa needs. So the infrastructural gap is still there. How both sides are going to work out a way out of this, not as if we expect China to be the partner for everything, but at least the relationship is still going to need those type of commitments. And hopefully that the African side can get it. Whether the Chinese are able to, they're able to do that, I think some people will argue, of course, because they still have a lot of large foreign reserve and savings, they still have capacity to do that. But then if you consider the global economic landscape, if you consider the geopolitical tensions and all of that, it's still a concern whether China will want to export that much capital outside of China to the rest of the world with all of these, concerns.
Cobus, what Ovigwe is saying echoes what we're hearing from a lot of African governments, that they are going to Beijing for this year's FOCAC with plans in hand for requests for large-scale infrastructure. That is not something that the Chinese have been financing Africa for several years now. The last data that we saw coming out of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center noted that in 2022, only $922 million of loans were extended. I mean, that is less than $1 billion. That's not going to fill that gap. So if what Ovigwe is saying is true, and I think he's right, it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of disappointment from the point of view of African stakeholders when they leave Beijing.
That, I think, is one possibility. The other possibility is that they somehow sense from the inside that there's about to be some kind of uptick in funding. That's not something that we've particularly picked up, but, who knows? I mean, obviously, these large-scale projects, even though they put a burden on China, in terms of funding, there's also very significant kind of economic, flowbacks to China from these large-scale projects for Chinese companies. And I keep wondering when those leaders kind of make these decisions, what, information they're basing that on. I was also wondering whether China is for the optics or the ongoing relationship, that they need to kind of muster those resources in some way. But I guess also on the other side is that there may be a kind of an acknowledgement on the African side that China is one of the few players in the world that is able to actually, both fund and deliver this kind of infrastructure, even though they're very constrained at the moment. That there just isn't anyone else, kind of to make these kind of, proposals to. Ovigwe, everyone has been emphasizing small is beautiful, as you've also said. Are you getting a sense that there is this kind of a strategic project planning among some of these African leaders to try and hit those small and beautiful targets in a way that actually makes sense in an African developmental context?
So let me start with my own country, Nigeria. So for Nigeria, for instance, there seems to be a lot of priority on actually completing existing large-scale infrastructure projects that haven't been finished. So whether it is the rail project, for instance, which is still there, and there's still a lot of news buzz around new financing. I'm talking about the Lagos-Kano railway. Sections of it have been done, other sections have not been done. People are also talking about even the southern corridor as well. So there's a lot of emphasis on those type of projects. For the rest of the continent, what you said now is very true. I think some countries, they really do not know how times have changed. They're still expecting to get those very massive 5 billion, 3 billion for a single project. Whether that is possible, I think it goes back to the risks, right? Because even though for African countries, we're not seeing this amount of being given, but if you follow, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, if you follow whenever China has this, China and Central Europe, I think the C4 plus
C5
plus.
Well, you have the C5 in Central Asia, yeah.
Exactly. You find that countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they still get a lot of this large amount of money given for projects, right? So I think from the Chinese side, there's emphasis of being even more strategic. The African side needs to then be aware, or at least take notes that the fact that yes, the money is still available. They can still fund project, but there's now more emphasis on how strategic this is. Not when I mean strategic now, not even just for getting China benefits, quote unquote, for how mutually benefit favors China and it doesn't put a lot of its money at risk, but really strategic in the real sense of the word. And in that context, many African countries don't have that kind of ground strategic position to really offer to China. Maybe people in countries like Egypt does, Tanzania does, South Africa could, but it is not a criteria that every African country fits. I'm talking about real geopolitical and strategic benefits now.
Ovigwe, it's so interesting that you say this because we just published a column this week by our friend Paul Nantulia, who's a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington. And let me read you a quote from his column that's on our website, and we're going to have Paul on our show as well to talk about this. So this is a direct quote. Africa must take greater ownership of its strategic thinking. While China has released multiple official statements and papers on its strategy in Africa, there's a glaring absence of corresponding papers detailing strategic approaches to China from African countries, regional bodies, or the continent as a whole. This asymmetry leaves Africa perpetually in a reactive stance, scrambling for benefits rather than driving the agenda. So the two of you are saying exactly the same thing because you make a very good point. Here in Southeast Asia, the Chinese are still talking about multi-billion-dollar railways and large-scale infrastructure, Central Asia as well. So the money is there, but you're right, it has to fit within China's strategic thinking. So you and Paul are saying the same thing there.
Yeah, I agree with him. And I'm speaking to him in a couple of days from now. So, of course, we'll continue this big conversation. So, this is really the issue. Now, when we look at some of the countries or clients or whatever that we are able to work with on this, for instance, we are advancing something and we're seeing interest and uptake is that, for instance, on trade, let's look at trade, for instance, right? Away from the big ground strategic kind of thinking. If countries are not able to do that, let's focus on certain areas you can move. On trade, African countries are saying that they want to use their resources strategically for their development. We've seen countries like DRC with cobalt and all of that. Zimbabwe has given out a statement. Nigeria banned even lithium because it's considered to now be officially the government. I don't put out the policy, but what they're saying is that they want to work with partners to make sure that these resources are of strategic benefit to their economies. Right now, how much investments can China make into value addition? Because the value addition is not the key operative term that countries want to do. They just don't want to trade out exports their raw materials. They want value addition. And this is not even just about China, because your ground strategic thinking has to be just the way it is. Any country who can fit into that, then you can work with that country, right? And one of my critique of this push towards value addition in natural resource sector is that many countries think they can really play both sides. That means, for instance, if I have lithium and they have all the time in their hands, so they're kind of really missing the landscape here, the reading. So you have lithium in the deposit. You want China or the US to come to value addition. But it's not always possible to have both countries working in one context, right? So it's almost like the case like you have to then choose where each of them will come in the value chain. I give you an example in Nigeria. Nigeria, when it was Tesla, or rather Elon Musk and his firm, they approached Nigeria for lithium deposits. The government said no, right? They don't want to export raw lithium. Now, in a state next to where I live, from Abuja, it's called Nasarawa State. There is a 4,000 ton per day lithium processing plant built by the Chinese. I think they're $110 million. Well, it is not full processing, but they are doing some form of refining. How would Nigerian government, for instance, then convince an American firm to import import what you're producing from that place? All of that probably has to go to China, right? So I think on trade, critical minerals trade particularly, our African government who have these deposits, they really need to think things through. Angola, Zambia, and they've been able to work out something, but even that is still mine to port. With that, I'm talking about Lobito Corridor, right, for instance. So I think there's a lot of thinking that still needs to be done on the African side, even at the economic level.
Sure. Let's now want to make sure I bring in some other voices. And Cobus and Ovigwe, I'd like to get your reaction to these different perspectives that we're going to get. And again, this is what's so interesting about this topic. You can see it from so many different ways. Our first perspective is coming from Pakwesi Heto, who is a Tobis Fellow and Chief Graeber Scholar at the UC Irvine Ethics Center. That's the University of California, Irvine. Go Anteaters in Southern California. Pakwesi is a longtime China Africa scholar. Let's take a listen to what he's looking for at the upcoming FOCAC.
What I would like to see coming out of the 9th FOCAC is a conscious effort to develop new rules and mechanisms to facilitate lending, and repayment. Africa needs the funding to be able to carry out bankable projects. But what has happened over the last couple of years is that non-performing loans has limited or restricted the availability of funding for important bankable projects. Therefore, an effort to develop new institutions and mechanisms under the auspices of FOCAC to facilitate lending and repayment will ensure that African states that have legitimate need for those funding could still access them in a way that actually aligns with Beijing's new thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative. The other issue that I think it's important that we need to focus more on is China's growing involvement in African security. I hope that our African leaders are able to negotiate better conditions under which Chinese involvement so that it doesn't become a bait and switch type of relationship where Chinese efforts to help would rather degenerate into unwanted colonization, unwanted meddling into domestic affairs of African states.
Cobus, so Pakwesi is concerned about debt mechanisms and, as what Ovigwe talked about as well, bringing in new loans, but finding ways, again, to service those loans, and obviously security, which is a growing concern in many parts of the continent as well. What's your reaction to Pakwesi's perspectives?
I definitely share his perspectives on debt. I'm similarly concerned, because, as Eguegu has also pointed out, Africa is facing this double impact from both not getting enough financing, but then also the terms of the financing they're getting is frequently very unfair or very steep. And the combination is holding back, development on the continent. So definitely, some move forward on debt. Like that would both be dealing with as Pakwesi was also saying, non-performing loans, but also some form of innovative kind of mechanism to bring in different kinds of financing, kind of more private sector financing. And in order to not and different kind of like equity stakes and so on, in order to lessen the amount of just pure debt landing on pure sovereign debt landing on these states. On the security issue, I am also very intrigued to see what the wording will be, but I don't particularly expect much firmer commitment from China, particularly in kind of hotspot areas like in Sudan, for example. It's. I tend to think that it's domestically unpopular in China and that they don't want to get involved. So I expect some form of at least lip service to be paid to security, but I also expect that it will probably happen under the auspices of the UN or as via kind of funding to the AU or something like that, something indirect. Ovigwe, what do you think? Do you think there is a chance for greater involvement in security issues?
Very brilliant point, I must say. But let me go back to the issue of de-risking. I think, China sees an issue with risks, right? Something we've been saying, and when I mean development Reimagined, is that one way to get around that, working with the African side, is to then put money into African financial institutions. That could help. So the AFDB is there, ADB is there, and all of these institutions are there, and they have their own way of looking at the market from a risk perspective, from feasibility studies, and none of that. That would be very, very good. The issue of security, so something I think is getting more and more obvious is that Africa-China relationship is now going back to the fundamentals. I've said this a couple of times in the sense that the relationship started as political even before it became economic, right? And now, given the geopolitical context, there is a real interest in seeing how Africa and Africa-China relationship can be of benefit to China in this context. So I'm talking about so-called great power competition. Right, but for the African perspective, they are not really interested in great power politics. At least that is what everybody says. But at the same time, because we have so much internal security issues, we've seen efforts from the Chinese side. For instance, there was a special envoy for the Horn of Africa trying to mediate what was the issue in Ethiopia. Then, but I think the Americans ended up being more successful in that context. in the West African side, there's a lot of problems. All of these schools and issues with terrorism and all of that. China still continues to partner with these countries. Whether Niger, for instance, there's a lot of investment that's still ongoing with the Agaden oil field and pipeline with Benin and all of these issues. Even China is even trying to mediate that conflict between Benin Republic and Niger to prevent that risk exploding in our face. And then, of course, even with Burkina Faso, with Mali, Senegal cooperation is still ongoing. One of the main things that I think needs to appear in FOCAC in this context is, if you remember, when the Global Security Initiative was the the white paper was published, there was a lot of emphasis on indivisibility of security or indivisible security. It's not a Chinese concept, by the way, that emerged out of the OECD that's in Europe, but China takes that view that security has to be indivisible. So everybody's security is interlinked, right? Now, that principle, whether that will then go into the FOCAC document is very, very interesting. I am looking forward to seeing that. But also, more importantly, if everybody's security is linked, what does that really mean, right? Does it mean that does that create the context where the long existing non-interference, you now have to balance the linkages of our security with non-interference? That means we can now sort of collaborate on security issues and not see that as non-interference, which has been a long existing principle, right? This is very, very crucial. And also from the Chinese side from the issues around South China Sea, Taiwan and all of that, does that now mean African countries who have traditionally said this is China's internal affairs will now start voicing their concern? Because if you look at what happens in South China Sea, if that blows up, of course, that's going to affect Africa, the way we saw some impact from the Ukraine context. So if we look at it from this perspective, if we see the indivisibility of security becomes a principle, I think it's going to change how China-Africa relationship from the security context which has been mostly about non-interference. Because now I think it is no longer the case that just saying Taiwan or South China Sea is an issue that African countries cannot speak of. China would want African countries to be more vocal in those issues. And the only way they can do that is that you then have to reconcile that question of non-interference. And indivisibility of security will be one of the ways that can be done.
Well, one of the things that we've noticed over the past year is that in all of the high-level engagements, either at the presidential level or at the foreign minister level, there's been a very strong emphasis by the Chinese on the Taiwan issue in African engagements. And so they are laying the groundwork that in the event of a conflict either in Taiwan or the South China Sea, that African countries would line up behind China on that. That is, I think, the work that they've been doing to date right now. Let's continue on with our survey of different perspectives from various China-Africa scholars. We're going to go to Pretoria now to Yushan Wu, who is a longtime China-Africa scholar. Many of you who've listened to the show for a long time may recognize her name. She's a research fellow now with the Ocean Regions Program in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria.
As with previous iterations of the forum, it is easy to be swept up with headlines and commitments, such as how much China will provide in terms of finances, or, like previously, vaccines. But we also need to look at the details, such as in the action plan and declaration, and in the case of new announcements, how they will develop and progress after the actual public event. I see the FOCAC as a co-constituted platform. What I mean by this is, while it is on one hand representative of a set of bilateral relations between China and African states, the willing attendance of African partners themselves, and we see this by the number of high-level attendees, and the evolving agenda to include areas of interest to the continent reflects this co-constitution. What will be interesting to see is how this continues to be reflected, particularly as China continues to emphasize its relations with the global south. Perhaps this was a result of the COVID pandemic and social distancing. The previous FOCAC was, for me, surprisingly public-facing. What I mean by this is we saw a website dedicated to the event and logistics around it. Perhaps this is credit to the African host, but we also saw spaces such as Zoom and Twitter become platforms where high-level information, speeches, and discussions surrounding the event were disseminated. I would be interested to see whether this was simply a result of the pandemic or a new way of doing the forum from its relatively official roots.
Cobus, normally FOCAC is a black box where we can't see inside what's happening. It all happens behind closed doors. Yushan's talking about the benefits that came from the pandemic, where it was more transparent. We did get to see some of these Zoom calls, and we got to see, remember, we saw pictures of behind the scenes where Wang Yi was in Dakar, was accepting the bids of various African governments. And again, there was just a lot more visibility into the process and the mechanics of FOCAC than we've seen previously. What's your expectation based on what Yushan was saying in terms of the level of transparency that we might be able to expect?
Yeah, I think she makes a really interesting point. Like, I think, because of the way that the pandemic kind of forced FOCAC to be kind of semi-hybrid, it then kind of opened this kind of space to see inside a little bit, and I think that has arguably maybe continued with the more expansive announcements, and for example, as you were saying, like the announcements of what will actually happen on the different days, which sounds like a small thing, but like it used to be almost impossible to get that information. Yeah. Like in the past, like even the official dates were announced about like a week and a half before the actual event. So in that sense, they seem to be moving in the direction of making aspects of it more public. What I think is going to be interesting is to see how much more insight we'll get into any of the discussions. And there, I think Twitter X could be a very interesting tool, as she was also saying, because last time there were these kind of, now and then things were kind of leaking out onto Twitter, and one got kind of little glimpses here and there of what was being discussed. So I hope that's the case this time as well.
Yeah. And Ovigwe, you were at the last FOCAC in Dakar. Tell us what it was like when you were there and the levels of transparency and the access to people and information that you had.
Yes, I was with two of my colleagues, Hannah and Jade. It was very interesting. I think we also were quite impressed by how they were able to get all of the logistics done well. We attended several side events. There was one around entrepreneurship that we participated in, and also being able to actually watch how the African officials engage with their Chinese counterparts that were present, right? So yeah, whether for us, we were able to, of course, speak to people, clients, partners on the African side, on the Chinese side. But we also were tracking all of the conversation between the officials, because of course we know FOCAC from beginning up to that point was very state-led. It's very much state-led. It's a government-to-government affair, right? And yeah, so I think now in Beijing, this is the first time since 2018 we're saying in Beijing, and lots of our colleagues are already gearing up, who are Beijing-based colleagues, and some of us will be going into China for the event.
Are you going to go this year?
Okay, so we're still discussing the logistics of that, but I'm looking forward to making the second appearance, yes, and being able to track that.
Lucky you.
Yeah, so the big thing for us in how FOCAC is changing is opening the event more and making sure people can track it in real time, or at least get an insight into what's happening in real time. It's so much of a welcome development, as opposed to everybody being outside waiting for the outcome documents, the declaration, the action plan, etc., etc. So this way, it doesn't seem so ivory tower. And because a lot of the criticism has been that this is about Africa's future, and we have a continent where there's such a huge and vibrant civil society. They want to always know what is happening, when it is happening, not when it is done, right? And but now, whether everybody, at least those who are interested, will be able to make it to China. I think a lot of people we're seeing lots and lots of interest from different organizations reaching out to us. We want to participate and this and that. I was saying, look, there's a due process, and you have to, we are a private consultancy. We, of course, are areas where we can plug in, but there's still a process that everybody has to go through, the due process. Everyone has to go through. And I think but it is changing for sure. In my view, it is changing positively if there's more access both to information and process.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd like to close our conversation. We've talked about what to expect. We've heard from Pakwesi and Yushan about what they are expecting, what they would like to see. Let's have you both take your magic wand out. And just like what Yushan and Pakwesi were doing, where they said, this is what I want them to see and to do. Cobus, what would be the one thing that you would like to see come out of FOCAC more than anything else in terms of outcomes? What's the one thing?
My number one kind of like on my wish list would be a more comprehensive and in some kind of way also financially sustainable kind of initiative towards increasing renewable energy, I think, in Africa. Like more expansive plans to put it in, particularly kind of popular electrification, like, outside of mining sites, for example, but also, kind of some kind of sustainable way of actually paying for that. I think that is the strong demand on the African side. There's a very big supply on the Chinese side. It could work well. And I think, it would be demonstrably beneficial in terms of development, I think.
Okay, so that's your wish list. Ovigwe, you're going to get the last word today. You have the magic wand. I'm passing it to you. What's the one thing that you want to come out of FOCAC more than anything else?
Okay, so I'm going to take liberty, since I woke up early for this, to make two wishes.
Two is fine. I'll grant you 2 wishes, by the way.
So one of them is process. I actually would like to see a more robust and very clear mechanism for tracking outcomes. We see these documents, this fine commitment and all of that. How do both sides go back after the event between now and the next FOCAC? What is the mechanism for us to track every single dollar commitment and measure? Yeah, that's something
which they don't have right now, correct?
Yeah.
There's no way to do that. So last time they promised $300 billion of imports. They promised $1 billion of vaccines. They promised $10 billion of the special drawing rights to the IMF would go to Africa. We have no way of verifying that.
Yeah, I mean, on the $10 billion of import, I think that's actually over 3 years. So maybe.
Didn't happen. We're not anywhere near close to that.
The second wish actually would be more on value-added trade. I'm a security person, but on this, from my point of view, given the condition in Africa now, all of the so-called youth restiveness and agitation of the continent is all about lack of jobs and people really worried about the quality of life experience that they're having. The way to do that is to create more jobs. And the way to create more jobs is to ensure that we're attracting FDI into value addition. That would suck up so much of the youth labor and have them engaged. So whether it's in critical mineral refining, yes. Whether it's in all other form of production of solar PVs, whatever we can get into the continent in terms of manufacturing jobs, that will be very, very important because many of these countries are facing real huge unemployment issues, and that is the way out of it.
Well, that goes back to your first point, though, is the need for large-scale infrastructure, because as you know, in your home country in Nigeria, the cost of electricity is very high. So maybe going back to get up the value chain, you have to get that infrastructure first in order to bring down the cost of production to make it competitive with places like here in Vietnam, for example. So those are intertwined with one another.
Yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, that has been a fascinating forecast into what we all expect coming out of FOCAC. Thank you, Yushan. Thank you, Pakwesi and Ovigwe, especially you for getting up at the ungodly hour of 3:45 in the morning to join us from Toronto. We really appreciate it. If people want to follow what your adventures are in terms of going to FOCAC and elsewhere, are you still posting on social media on X?
Yes, I still post on Twitter. It's just my name, Ovigwe Eguegu. That's at Ovigwe Eguegu. And also on LinkedIn at Ovigwe Eguegu.
Okay. We'll put links to both of those in the show notes. And Cobus, thank you as well for joining us. That'll do it. Remember, all month of August, we are going to focus on FOCAC, on the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. We're going to have some fantastic experts joining us over the next few weeks. And again, more contributions from scholars around the world, like what Yushan and Pakwesi did. So make sure to keep tuned for us on this channel all month. And then over on the website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, we are publishing some amazing insights from different scholars and also from Cobus as well. We're going to be publishing next week a 2-part PDF that Cobus did looking at FOCAC from the African side and the Chinese side. You're not going to want to miss this. It's absolutely indispensable. It's fantastic. So we'll have that available, and we'll make sure that everybody on the show here knows where to get that. So for Ovigwe in Toronto and Cobus in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. Thanks so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.